as the edge of the Central Highlands. It and the demilitarized zone, where the Marines were up in I-Corps, were the two heaviest sprayed areas in the whole country. Again, we didn't know that until after the war ended either, but it was one of those things that was necessary at the time and hadn't been properly tested. And there's a bill in Congress right now to dedicate a bronze plaque at the V of the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, recognizing the deaths of all of those who have died as a result of their service in Vietnam, which is kind of a tongue-in-cheek way of saying the tens of thousands that are dying of cancer from their exposure to Agent Orange.
How do you feel about that?
Well, it's interesting because when I first became a veterans advocate in 1979, there was a group called Agent Orange Victims International. It had been started by a guy who passed away within a couple of years down in Connecticut. And when I heard about it, I knew that we had been sprayed and that I'd worked in sprayed areas, but I didn't think anything of it. And when it started to come out that there were going to be health problems as a result of it, I was concerned. But again, at that point, I still didn't realize that I was in one of the heavier spray zones. The government did not cooperate in addressing the Agent Orange issue initially. We didn't have a lot of support from the traditional service organizations. It was mostly Vietnam veterans who already had a bad rap for being complainers. That's what we were told by some of the older veterans and members of the press, quite frankly. But we persevered. The first person to ever do a study of dioxin in the human body was Mount Sinai Environmental Health Center in New York City in 1981. I heard about it and went down and went through 3 days of testing, including 9 tubes of blood for samples over a 3-day period of time. And it indicated they were using an spectrum microscope, an electronic microscope essentially, that could break down cells and determine the parts per million of dioxin in human fatty tissue cells. At that time, I learned that I had dioxin in my system, and Dr. Dom, who was running the study, said, "We don't know what causes it to release and cause the cancers. We suspect that it may have to do with drastic changes in weight." Well, that was a great relief to me, because until 1990, I could still fit into the uniform that they had issued me in 1967. I never gained or lost much weight at all, so I thought, well, I'll probably be safe. That may be one of the ways that it's released, but clearly it's not the only way.
Did they tell you how many parts per million were in your blood cells at that time? Did you get like a reading?
I have a report, a medical report from it, but I really don't recall. And they weren't even aware of the significance of what would be a lethal amount at that point.
Because this was an initial study, so.
Yes, and the Air Force was ordered by Congress to study Operation Ranch Hand personnel, who were the people who worked on the planes, loaded the planes, and flew the planes, who actually sprayed the stuff. It turns out that the study that was done somehow was falsified when it went before Congress. And when that came out, Congress ordered the Air Force and there's a health institute, National Health Institute in Georgia. It's not the National Academy of Sciences.
National Institutes of Health?
No. Center for Disease Control.
Yes, CDC, sorry.
That the CDC and both the Air Force were complicit in essentially hiding information from the Congress. So they were ordered to redo it, and at the same time, some private studies started to be done that were verifying how toxic this stuff was. In 1980, the EPA had actually been helpful because it was the only substance that had ever been banned outright for use in the United States. It was used extensively in the U.S. for clearing railroad and telephone line right-of-ways, electrical power line right-of-ways, and we were getting some really good information from them. Frankly, when the election resulted in a new direction in this country, most of the people that I was dealing with in the EPA in '79 disappeared. They weren't there anymore. We went through a pretty hard fight for a lot of years to get studies to establish a plausible connection of probability between the diseases and the exposure to Agent Orange. When you look at the numbers, it statistically shows that if you were exposed to the chemical, you are so many times more likely than the general population to develop these illnesses and cancers. There's still never been any way to determine if every specific cancer is a direct result of the exposure. In other words, there's no test that can be done that could be done on people now who are not sick to determine whether or not the cancer is going to affect them at some point. When the VA was ordered to do an Agent Orange screening back in the late 80s, the screening involved a chest x-ray, blood pressure, temperature, and a urinalysis. None of those things would even remotely detect exposure levels to Agent Orange. It was, frankly, a kind of a boondoggle. But eventually, when enough of the test results were in, the Congress ordered the Department of Veterans Affairs to compensate veterans for with certain diseases, and the children of Vietnam veterans who suffered from spina bifida to be compensated. Now, that was also the first time in the history of the Department of Veterans Affairs that children of veterans had ever been compensated for any disease related to their military service. We fought that fight for a lot of years, and at one point I traveled with a Medal of Honor recipient named Sam Davis from Illinois, trying to generate interest in the press. I remember newspaper reporters saying that story was done. We did that story last year. And my response, of course, was, but people are still dying this year. I mean, has it become non-news? In 1980, I went to Boston to work full-time as a veterans advocate. And my first job was as a National Service Officer for the Military Order of the Purple Heart. And I helped veterans with claims for disability in the VA system. I set the office up and did that for about 2 years and then found a replacement because, frankly, I mean, it's quite a paradox, but the Reagan administration established a program called the Vietnam Veterans Leadership Program. I was chosen as the executive director for the program to be established in Boston and set that program up and ran it. When I did, I had a board of directors who were former pilots. The chairman of the board was Major General George S. Patton III, World War II General Patton's son. I was a pretty distinguished board of fighter pilots and veterans who had come home and done very well, were very successful. I believe every member of the board except for one had been an officer. And of course, I, being an enlisted person, was the director. And I was given a lot of freedom to choose the direction of the program. And the two things that I did with it, and they're issues that I've always felt very strongly about. One was dealing with the media, trying to attempt to change the negative stereotype of Vietnam veterans that was so pervasive in this country through the late 70s and into the early 80s. And the other was an employment program, because I believe that part of any individual's dignity and self-worth is directly related to their ability to find meaningful employment. Statistically, Vietnam veterans' rate of unemployment has always been twice that of their non-veteran peers. That was true for years and years and years. I'm not sure if it is still now, but it certainly was for the first 20 years after the war.
What are the causes of that unemployment statistic, do you think?
Well, I think a great deal of it had to do with the negative stereotype. I have a friend who has his PhD, and when he did his master's thesis, it was